I'm Ashley Korslin. Welcome to Wicked West, a series that explores mysterious folklore of the Pacific Northwest and tales of old-time crime. Our first story is set in the 1850s as settlers moved out to the American West. That's where a wife and mother became the first woman to be charged with murder in the new Oregon Territory. Here's the Axe Murderess. In May of 1854, the Lamb family gathered around the dinner table in their small cabin. They had settled in Clackamas in the new Oregon Territory after the incredibly difficult journey on the Oregon Trail. Nathaniel Lamb sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his children. His wife, Charity, stepped outside the cabin and retrieved an axe from a woodpile. As the story goes, she came back inside, holding her new baby in one arm and the axe in the other. Charity swung it into the back of Nathaniel's head twice. He lived for almost a week before dying from his injuries. Charity was taken into custody and would be charged with first-degree murder.
She was the first woman ever in the Oregon Territory charged with murder and would be the first woman tried for murder.
First-degree murder carried a penalty of death. Newspapers had a field day with the spectacle. Words like monster and cold-blooded splashed across the front pages.
Obviously, this was, fodder for today would have been the tabloids. And back then, a lot of the newspapers were very tabloidy. And so this was a story you could imagine that went through the Oregon Territory, a buzz.
Charity's murder trial would last for 6 days. The judge, the prosecutor, and jurors were all men. Women had virtually no rights during this time. They wouldn't be allowed to vote in Oregon for another 60 years.
You were often, property, a little more than property.
For the prosecutor, the case was open and shut. Charity had murdered her husband. Her children even testified to it. The prosecutor argued intent, presenting a singular motive to the court. Charity had been having an affair with another man, he said, and wanted Nathaniel out of the picture.
As the story evolves over time, why did she do this? Some thought perhaps because a man had been in town recently, living nearby from California, and there was talk that he had developed a romantic interest in both Charity and Marianne, her 19-year-old daughter, and that both were interested in him romantically as well.
Charity's attorneys argued that Nathaniel was horribly abusive and Charity feared for her life.
Nathaniel was very abusive, threw a hammer at her, abusive language to her, threatened her frequently, threatened to shoot her, treated her like a servant as opposed to a wife.
But there were no larger societal conversations of domestic violence at the time, and few legal protections for women. So Charity's attorneys tried another strategy. They argued she was deranged and didn't comprehend the severity of her actions, therefore could not be held responsible. The law acknowledged insanity as a complete defense to crimes of intent.
They argued that, again, that she didn't have enough mental capabilities to plan this. It was in a heat of passion, as opposed to premeditated.
In the end, the jury returned a guilty verdict, but the judge spared Charity from the punishment of death and instead sentenced her to life in prison.
Charity, as a woman, was assigned the laundry duty. She did the laundry for the other inmates. She did the laundry for the warden's family. Was her duty, and she was in prison there for 8 years.
She was eventually placed in a mental asylum, never taking full responsibility for murdering her husband.
Never really apologized, and you could tell as time went on that she may have been losing touch with reality, but sometimes denied it, sometimes admitted it, but never really apologized for it.
Charity Lamb, nicknamed Oregon's first convicted murderess, lived in the asylum for 15 years until her death in 1879. She was roughly 65 years old. We go now to the 1920s for the tale of a small town mayor who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. He had gone for a walk over the newly constructed interstate bridge, which was a very controversial project at the time. After an exhaustive search, the body of Grover Percival was found weeks later, hanging from a tree. But was it suicide or murder? Here's the bridge ghost. On a rainy, cold morning in October of 1920, Grover Percival, the outgoing mayor of Vancouver, Washington, went out for a leisurely walk around town. He had recently decided not to run for re-election and seemed happy to focus on his family and his successful insurance business.
And Grover was seen walking around downtown, tipping his hat to the ladies, happy.
He smiled as he enjoyed the view during his walk across the newly built interstate bridge. As mayor, Grover had helped get the bridge built a few years prior. It connected Vancouver to Portland and Washington to Oregon. Grover took this walk over his prized interstate bridge often, but his stroll on this drizzly autumn day would be his last.
And then he didn't come home that night.
By the next day, almost the entire town was out searching for the missing mayor. Businesses downtown closed early. Hundreds of men searched high and low around all parts of the city and the Columbia River.
They found bodies downstream, and the family would go, and no, it wasn't him.
Days passed with no trace of Grover. The local newspaper kept a running tab on his absence.
In fact, the Columbian had a little box up in the upper right-hand corner, still no sign of the mayor.
Rumors flew. Maybe the mayor drowned, or left on a train out of town, or maybe someone killed him. After all, as a politician who fought to build the controversial interstate bridge, Grover had enemies. Some townspeople were very angry about the cost of building the bridge and the tolls that came with it. Nearly a month went by. Coordinated searches started to dwindle. Then, on a cold November day, a hunter discovered an ominous scene in a wilderness area a few miles from town.
Found the mayor hanging from a tree by his handkerchief.
Grover left no farewell note to his wife or family. Investigators declined to call for a formal inquest, saying there was no evidence of foul play.
It was put down as a suicide, though no one could point to a reason. Said he was in good shape, his business was in good shape.
But those who knew Grover refused to believe he did this intentionally. They speculated that he was murdered. Those whispers of something sinister have taken on a life of their own over the decades. They've morphed into a modern-day ghost story. People have reported seeing an apparition of a tall, slender man wearing a fedora walking across the bridge at night.
They had seen a tall, slender figure walking south on the old span. The southbound span is the 100-plus-year-old span. And when the figure got to the hump, it would disappear.
The description of the ghost doesn't match anyone else who perished near the bridge, like those who jumped to their deaths or drowned in the river below. Many believe it's the missing mayor.
He is seen now walking toward Hayden Island to his doom. Whether it was suicide or murder, no one ever knew.
So even though Grover Percival's life ended, his story certainly has not. Today, he's known as the Interstate Bridge Ghost. They had planned it for weeks, but it only took a couple hours for this group of grave robbers to unearth the corpse of one of Oregon's most prominent citizens. The crime sent shockwaves through Portland in the 1890s, and it all came to an end because of some mistakes made by these bumbling thieves. Here's the grave robbing ghouls. He was one of Portland's most prominent leaders, William Sergeant Ladd. He served 2 terms as mayor and helped develop the city in the late 1800s.
And over time, he would become involved in everything in Portland and in Oregon. Manufacturing, transportation, railroads. He invested in everything.
Ladd also founded Portland's first bank. His entrepreneurial ventures garnered him a nice fortune. His net worth was estimated at between $150 and $250 million by today's standards. And while Ladd was admired for his philanthropy, he was also known as a shrewd businessman.
If you did not pay your mortgage, then the bank would foreclose.
His reputation and his wealth made him a target even after his death in 1893. A man named Daniel Magone had a deep desire to capitalize on the Ladd family fortune. Magone, who had lost his property in the economic depression in the 1890s, had an axe to grind with the rich and powerful who controlled the city. He had also experienced the trauma of watching his young daughter drown.
Some people again wondered whether he was losing his sanity because he started to talk about plots to do things to get his money back, to find some way to get revenge on those who had taken his property away from him.
Magone developed a plan to steal Ladd's body from his grave at the Riverview Cemetery and hold it for ransom.
Came up with this plan to take Mr. Ladd's corpse and to hold it for ransom for $50,000. To ask the Ladd family, to pay $50,000 to get his body back.
But he couldn't do it alone, so Magone enlisted the help of 3 men. One was a ne'er-do-well named Charles Montgomery, who also wanted to get revenge on the wealthy elite. Magone told the other 2 helpers that they were stealing the body to donate to medical research, which of course was a lie. The cemetery had no guards, which made for an easy entrance and escape. But the men were paranoid they would be caught, so they stole a field telephone and tapped into the town's phone lines to monitor any calls about suspicious activity at the cemetery.
They were convinced that the Ladd family had some sort of alarm at the gravesite that would go off.
After digging late into the night, the body snatchers finally reached Ladd's coffin.
They take what was described as a very well-embalmed, well-preserved Mr. Ladd from his coffin, and they take him with him, carry him down to the river.
There, they dug a hole and buried Ladd in a makeshift grave. The thieves escaped in a boat, and Magone crafted his ransom plans. Except there was one hitch. Magone and his men had made a huge mistake. The knife they had used to pry open the coffin had been accidentally left behind at the cemetery.
The police arrive at the scene, find the knife. They go to the local blacksmith. "Oh, I made that knife," he said. "I made it for Daniel Magone." He remembers who he made it for. So right away, the jig is up.
Montgomery ratted out Magone instantly and led police to the shallow grave by the river. Magone was arrested and went on trial without ever achieving his goal of ransoming Ladd's body. Magone attempted to plead insanity, but the jury didn't buy it. He spent 2 years in prison for the grave robbery. And as for the Ladd family, they made sure no thief could ever steal their beloved again.
Once they got the body back, they put it back in the casket, they put it in the ground, and they poured concrete around. His grave site now is would be very tough to get into the casket.
Adultery, sex, and murder. This next story has it all. In the early 1900s, dozens of women were swept up in what they believed to be a new religion that offered salvation. But in reality, the Brides of Christ Church was little more than a cult that destroyed families and divided a once close-knit community. Here's the Brides of Edmond. He started one of the first known cults in Oregon history. His name, Edmund Crefeld. The German immigrant came to Corvallis in the early 1900s working for the Salvation Army. But in 1903, he formed his own church he called the Brides of Christ Church. It was widely regarded as a cult in town. Still, dozens of women, many of them wealthy, abandoned their families to join Edmund. Some even brought their children with them.
He sees himself as the second coming of Jesus, and they see him as Jesus. Some tell people that he is Jesus, and he stages these elaborate services with chanting and singing and him preaching.
During services, the congregation would roll on the ground, writhing in excitement. This led others to refer to Edmund's followers as the Holy Rollers. Edmund was very charismatic, flashy, and charming, but he was a charlatan and fraud and preyed upon the most vulnerable.
And soon stories develop about Mr. Crefeld being quite the Lothario and taking liberties with many of the women in his congregation.
That did not impress the husbands, fathers, and brothers of the women who joined the Brides of Christ Church. One night, an angry mob tarred and feathered Edmund. He survived.
It does not scare him out of town, and perhaps it also motivates him.
Right after the attack, Edmund married one of his parishioners, Maud Hurt.
And it said that at the wedding, one could smell tar. It was soon after he had been tarred and feathered, and he had perhaps not cleaned himself up enough.
Edmund was also allegedly involved in a romantic relationship with his new bride's mother, Sarah Hurt, and another woman in town too. Adultery was a crime and prosecutable by law, so authorities set out to arrest Edmund. He went on the run, and without their cult leader, the Brides of Christ inevitably split up. Some of the women were sent to insane asylums, and children who didn't have fathers were sent to orphanages. Meanwhile, Edmund did his best to hide from police.
He hides under a house, trying to avoid arrest for the crime of adultery. Eventually is found under Sarah Hurt's house in Corvallis, naked, hiding under the house, trying to avoid capture, is tried for adultery, convicted, and serves a year and a half or so in prison for adultery.
After getting out of prison in 1906, Edmund tried to get the Holy Rollers back together. That sent the community into an uproar.
Again, it's suspected that he has taken liberties with all these women who were part of his congregation.
So the men in town escalated their plans of retaliation. A man whose wife had joined the cult found Edmund hiding out on the Oregon coast. He tried to shoot Edmund, but the gun misfired.
After this incident in Newport, Crefeld is a little more concerned for his life. So he flees Oregon and he heads to Seattle with Maud, his wife.
This is where Edmund's luck ran out. An angry relative of one of Edmund's followers tracked the cult leader down and shot him dead. The vigilante was the older brother of 16-year-old Esther Mitchell, who was rumored to be Edmund's next bride. George Mitchell went on trial for murder, but with a jury that was not sympathetic to Edmund Crefeld, Mitchell was acquitted.
But the story does not end there.
A few days after the trial, Mitchell himself was murdered, shot and killed by his 16-year-old sister, Esther. As punishment, Esther was placed in an asylum, and the Brides of Christ Church was effectively over, closing a chapter on perhaps the most infamous cult in Oregon history. Lighthouses captivate us with their beauty and intrigue us with their mystery. They're often the perfect setting for ghost stories. This next tale takes us to Newport, Oregon, where the legend of the Yaquina Bay Lighthouse ghost possibly saved the building from demolition. Here's the haunted lighthouse. Perched high atop a windswept bluff along Oregon's central coast stands a lonely white lighthouse. It's believed to be the oldest structure in Newport.
It's a house with a little light tower in the roof. I mean, it's the only wooden lighthouse in the state.
But it's not the lighthouse's modest beauty that has attracted such attention over the last 150 years. Instead, some say its ghostly reputation saved this piece of history from the wrecking ball.
People literally formed a human chain around it to stop them.
The Yaquina Bay Lighthouse was built in 1871, only to be decommissioned 3 years later. It fell into disrepair and was almost forgotten. That is, until a magazine writer gave it new life in 1889.
The story is called The Haunted Light at Newport by the Sea by Lishan M. Miller.
The short story, published in Pacific Monthly magazine, told a mysterious tale about the lighthouse.
Situated at Yaquina on the coast of Oregon is an old deserted lighthouse.
The article was portrayed as fiction.
Its weather-beaten walls are wrapped in mystery.
Although no one really knows
Of an afternoon when the fog comes drifting in from the sea,
where author Lishan Miller got her inspiration.
it is the loneliest place in the world.
It tells about a young girl named Muriel Trevenard, left at a boarding house by her seafaring father. One day, Muriel and a group of kids went to explore the abandoned lighthouse on the hill, where they found a secret door inside.
And looked around and they found this weird thing in a linen closet in the upstairs. The wainscoting had been removed and there was a hole that went straight down into the bluff, way down, and they threw lighted bits of paper down it, but they couldn't see the bottom and they couldn't figure out whether it even had a bottom. It was just a pit. And so then a fog came in and they all got all creeped out and decided to go. So they left.
But Muriel left her handkerchief in the lighthouse and went back alone to retrieve it. Her friends heard screams and ran after her. When they got to the linen closet, the hole in the wall of the lighthouse was mysteriously covered.
There was no evidence of Muriel Trevenard, but a, quote, pool of warm red blood.
The story ends with no answers about what happened to the young girl.
So it's a wonderful story. It's really well built.
And people loved it. The ghost story took on a life of its own, garnering the lighthouse an infamous reputation. In the 1940s, the structure was scheduled for demolition. A group of residents formed the Lincoln County Historical Society in an effort to save it.
Of course, part of the reason they wanted to save it was because it had gotten so much attention from this ghost story that was apparently fiction.
The group raised money, and with the help of a wealthy industrialist, the lighthouse was spared from demolition. It went on to become a county museum for a time and was ultimately restored as a working lighthouse. Today, it's listed in the National Register of Historic Places.
Yes, the lore is that Muriel haunts the lighthouse.
And yes, the ghost stories live on.
People still ask to see the bloodstains upstairs.
People have reported seeing a ghostly figure of a young girl in the windows and claim to hear screams at night.
I mean, there are people out there who still think that it's a true story.
Fiction or not, this literary ghost is credited with helping to preserve history.
As time went by, the story was forgotten by all but those who joined in that weary search for the missing girl. But to this day it is said the blood stains are dark upon the floor in that upper chamber, and one there was who carried the little handkerchief next his heart till the hour of his own tragic death. The end. It's so good.
To hear the full episodes of all 6 of these stories, you can find the Wicked West podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. To learn more information and see photographs, you can visit kgw.com/wickedwest. I'm Ashley Korslund. Thanks for watching.